At the corner of bustling Oak Street stood a well-loved convenience store, its windows gleaming in the late afternoon sun. The shop had been a neighborhood staple for 15 years, known for its friendly service and well-stocked shelves. Inside, a teenage girl moved quietly between the aisles, her dark curly hair tied back neatly as she worked. The girl had grown up in this store, watching it transform from a small family business into the heart of their community. Now a high school junior with dreams of becoming a lawyer, she spent her weekends helping out, just as she had since she was tall enough to reach the counter. Today was supposed to be like any other day, checking inventory, restocking shelves, and chatting with the regular customers who'd watched her grow up. She wore her usual weekend outfit, jeans, sneakers, and a comfortable hoodie, rather than the store's blue uniform vest. Her father was away at an important suppliers conference, leaving her in charge alongside the assistant manager. It was a sign of trust that made her proud, even if it meant missing out on hanging with friends at the mall. As she moved through the store, she pulled items from shelves and carefully counted them, logging numbers into her tablet. The familiar beep of the entrance door barely registered as she concentrated on her task. The store was quiet, with just a few afternoon shoppers browsing the aisles, Mrs. Chen picking up her weekly groceries, and Mr. Rodriguez getting his usual coffee and newspaper. The girl smiled, remembering how her father had taught her the importance of inventory management. Every item tells a story, he'd say, showing her how to track what sold best in different seasons, how to spot patterns in their customers' needs. It was more than just counting, it was understanding their community. She pulled her backpack closer, using it to carry her tablet and inventory sheets as she worked. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the clean tile floor. The smell of fresh coffee wafted from the recently restocked machine, mixing with the scent of newly delivered bread from the local bakery. Regular customers waved as they passed by, used to seeing her work. Some even joked about how she was becoming more and more like her father, dedicated, thorough, and always ready with a kind word. The store's bell chimed again as more customers entered, bringing with them the sounds of the busy street outside. She had just knelt down to count the lower shelves when the atmosphere in the store suddenly changed. Heavy footsteps approached, and a shadow fell across her workspace. Looking up, she found herself staring into the stern face of a police officer she'd never seen before. His hand was already resting on his belt, his expression hard and suspicious. The girl's heart began to race, though she wasn't sure why. She'd done nothing wrong. This was her father's store, her weekend routine, her normal life. But something in the officer's eyes told her that none of that mattered. Not to him, not right now. As she started to stand, tablet in hand to explain her presence, the officer's voice cut through the store's peaceful atmosphere like a knife. "Don't move," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for discussion. The few customers in the store turned to stare, their faces showing confusion and concern. The gentle beeping of the store's electronic door chimes suddenly seemed ominous rather than welcoming. The afternoon sun, which had felt warm and comforting moments ago, now felt harsh and exposing. In just a few seconds, her familiar world had transformed into something entirely different, something she'd only heard about from others, but had never experienced herself. And as she looked into the officer's unyielding eyes, she realized this ordinary day was about to become anything but routine. The new police officer stood in the middle of the convenience store, his presence casting an uncomfortable shadow over the usually peaceful atmosphere. He'd only been in this district for 3 weeks, transferred from an upscale neighborhood across town. His previous beat had been different, pristine lawns, luxury cars, and faces that mostly looked like his own. Today had started like any other day for him, routine patrol, watching the streets, looking for anything suspicious. When he passed by the convenience store, something caught his eye. Through the large windows, he'd spotted a young black teenager putting items into a backpack. In his mind, the scene immediately fit into a familiar pattern, one shaped by years of unconscious bias and preconceptions. He didn't notice the tablet in her hands, didn't see how methodically she was working, didn't spot the regular customers nodding hello to her as they shopped. Instead, he saw what he expected to see, what he'd been conditioned to look for in his previous posting. His hand instinctively moved to his radio as he parked his patrol car. The store's security cameras silently recorded his entry, capturing how he bypassed the friendly assistant manager's greeting, how his eyes locked onto the girl immediately. The cameras caught what he didn't, the confused looks from customers who knew the girl, the way Mrs. Chen clutched her shopping basket tighter, how Mr. Rodriguez slowly lowered his newspaper, watching with growing concern. The officer's boots squeaked against the clean floor as he approached. His previous precinct had given him a reputation, a high number of stops and searches, mostly of minority individuals. His supervisors had praised his proactive policing, never questioning the patterns in his arrest records. Now, in this new neighborhood, those old habits were about to create a situation that would change many lives. He watched the girl's movements, interpreting her careful inventory work as suspicious behavior. When she reached into her backpack to check her tablet, his suspicions seemed confirmed. The fact that she looked comfortable in the store, that she moved with the confidence of someone who belonged there, didn't register in his mind. The afternoon sun continued to stream through the windows, but now it illuminated a scene of growing tension. Regular customers exchanged worried glances. The assistant manager stepped out from behind the counter, sensing trouble. The girl herself remained focused on her work, unaware of the approaching confrontation. The officer's radio crackled softly at his shoulder as he moved closer. His previous experiences had taught him to expect resistance, to anticipate denial. He'd heard every excuse before, or so he thought. His hand rested on his belt, close to his handcuffs, ready for what he assumed would come next. Some of the customers had already pulled out their phones, sensing that something wasn't right. They knew the girl, knew her father, knew this store was as much her home as any place could be. But to the officer, their concerned faces only registered as potential interference. The security cameras continued their silent recording as the officer positioned himself near the girl. His shadow fell across her workspace, and when she looked up, their eyes met. In that moment, two very different worlds collided. Her world of belonging and purpose, his world of suspicion and assumed guilt. The girl's tablet beeped softly as she finished scanning another item, the sound eerily final in the now quiet store. The afternoon that had started so normally was about to become something else entirely, a moment that would expose deep-rooted prejudices and force an entire community to confront uncomfortable truths. In the growing silence, the store's open sign continued to buzz faintly, its blue light washing over a scene frozen in time, a teenager doing her job, a police officer making assumptions, and a community holding its breath, knowing they were about to witness something that would change their neighborhood forever. "What do you think you're doing?" The officer's voice cut through the store's quiet atmosphere like a steel blade. The teenage girl looked up from her tablet, confusion clear in her eyes. Around them, the regular customers froze, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. "I'm doing inventory, sir," she replied calmly, holding up her tablet to show him the spreadsheet filled with numbers and product codes. Her voice remained steady, though her heart hammered in her chest. She'd heard stories about situations like this, but had never imagined it happening to her, especially not in her father's store. The officer's face hardened. "Put the backpack down slowly," he commanded, ignoring her explanation. His hand remained near his belt, his stance rigid and authoritative. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to buzz louder in the tense silence that followed. "Officer, I can explain," she started again, her voice still calm but carrying a slight tremor. "This is my father's store. I work here every weekend. I can show you my ID, or you can ask any of these customers." She gestured to the familiar faces around them, people who had watched her grow up between these aisles. But the officer wasn't listening. In his mind, he'd already written the story, another shoplifter caught in the act, another case to add to his record. "I said, put the backpack down," he repeated, his voice rising. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The assistant manager stepped forward, his name tag catching the light. "Officer, there's been a mistake. She's the owner's daughter. She's supposed to be here." His words carried the weight of truth, but they seemed to bounce off the officer's predetermined conclusions. Several customers had their phones out now, recording the interaction. Mrs. Chen, who had bought her groceries at this store for over a decade, spoke up. "She helped her father every weekend. This is wrong." Her voice shook with emotion as she clutched her shopping basket. The girl slowly placed her tablet on a nearby shelf, her movements careful and deliberate. "Sir, please, Let me just call my father. He can verify everything I'm telling you. She reached for her phone, but the officer interpreted this as a threatening movement. Hands where I can see them, he barked, causing several customers to gasp. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows cast strange shadows across the scene, like nature itself was trying to highlight the absurdity of the situation. Mr. Rodriguez, still holding his half-read newspaper, stepped closer. Officer, we all know her. She's not stealing anything. She's working, just like she does every weekend. His words carried the frustration of someone watching injustice unfold in real time. The security cameras continued their silent recording as more customers gathered at the ends of the aisles, their faces showing a mix of concern and outrage. The girl stood perfectly still now, her hands visible, her tablet forgotten on the shelf. The inventory sheet she'd been so carefully filling out fluttered slightly in the air conditioning breeze. I'm going to need you to turn around, the officer stated, reaching for his handcuffs. The metal clinked ominously in the quiet store. Outside, passing pedestrians began to slow down, noticing the growing tension through the large store windows. The girl's voice, when she spoke again, carried a strength that belied her age. I know my rights, officer. I've done nothing wrong, and there are witnesses here who can verify who I am. Her words were clear, measured, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her fear. The afternoon that had started with routine inventory had transformed into something else entirely, a moment that would soon expose deep-rooted prejudices and challenge an entire community to stand up for what was right. The simple beep of the store's door sensor announced new customers walking in, unknowingly stepping into a situation that was about to become much bigger than a simple misunderstanding in a corner store. The cold metal of the handcuffs sent shivers down the girl's spine as the officer moved behind her. Through the store windows, more people had gathered, pressing their faces against the glass. Some had their phones out, recording everything. The small convenience store had become an unwilling stage for a scene that was all too familiar in today's world. Please, the girl said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. My phone is in my pocket. Just let me call my father. She could feel the eyes of every customer on her, their familiar faces now filled with helpless anger and concern. The tablet on the shelf still displayed the inventory sheet she'd been working on just moments ago. The assistant manager tried again, moving closer with his hands raised. Officer, I'm the assistant manager here. I can show you the employment records. She's telling the truth. His voice carried years of experience dealing with difficult situations, but nothing had prepared him for this. The officer's response was immediate and harsh. Step back, or you'll be arrested for interfering with police business. His voice echoed through the suddenly silent store. The coffee machine gurgled in the background, an oddly normal sound in such an abnormal moment. More phones appeared in customers' hands. Someone was live streaming the entire incident. Through the windows, the crowd outside had grown larger. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor, making everyone's movements seem more dramatic, more significant. I'm not resisting, the girl said clearly, making sure her voice would be picked up by all the recording phones. I'm a minor and I work here. This is my father's store. She repeated the words like a mantra, staying calm even as tears threatened to spill from her eyes. Mrs. Chen had abandoned her shopping basket. Her trembling hands held her phone steady as she filmed. I'm calling your father right now, she called out to the girl. Don't worry, sweetheart. This will all be sorted out. Her fingers shook as she dialed the number she'd had for years. The officer's radio crackled with static, making everyone jump. Dispatch, I have a shoplifting suspect in custody. He spoke into it, ignoring the chorus of protests from the customers. Requesting backup for crowd control. The word crowd seemed to echo off the store's walls, making the situation feel even more surreal. Mr. Rodriguez had moved to the door, speaking rapidly into his phone. You need to get down here now, he was saying to someone. They're arresting her. Yes, in her own store. No, the officer won't listen to anyone. His free hand was clenched into a tight fist at his side. The handcuffs clicked into place, the sound seeming to break something in the atmosphere. Several customers started speaking at once, their voices rising in protest. The assistant manager was on his store phone now too, his face red with frustration as he tried to reach someone who could help. Outside, cars were slowing down as they passed, some stopping completely. The sidewalk was filling up with concerned neighbors, their faces pressed against the glass. The story was already spreading through social media, drawing more attention with each passing minute. The girl stood perfectly still, her back straight, her head held high despite the circumstances. She'd learned about situations like this in school, had discussed them at dinner with her father, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The weight of the handcuffs felt like more than just metal. It was the weight of prejudice, of assumptions, of a system that sometimes saw guilt before innocence. The store's security cameras continued their silent vigil, recording every moment, every word, every reaction. Soon, these recordings would tell a story that would reach far beyond their neighborhood. But for now, time seemed to stand still in the small convenience store as everyone waited for what would happen next. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The small convenience store, usually a place of friendly chatter and quick shopping trips, had become the center of a growing storm. Outside, the crowd had swelled to fill the sidewalk, their voices rising in unified protest. Inside, the teenage girl stood dignified despite the handcuffs, surrounded by longtime customers who had become impromptu witnesses. "This is going viral," someone in the crowd announced, holding up their phone. The live stream had already caught the attention of local news stations. Comments were pouring in by the hundreds, many from people who knew the store, knew the family, knew the truth of the situation. The assistant manager was still on the phone, his voice carrying across the store. "Yes, I understand you're busy, but this is urgent. An officer is arresting the owner's daughter in her own store." He paced behind the counter, running his free hand through his hair in frustration. Through the windows, familiar faces from the neighborhood continued to arrive. The elderly couple who lived upstairs, the teachers from the school across the street, the regulars from the coffee shop next door, all drawn by messages and calls spreading rapidly through their community. "Look at this," Mrs. Chen said, showing her phone to another customer. "People are sharing their own videos. The whole city will see this." Her hands still trembled, but her voice carried a note of determination. The digital age had given them a powerful tool, the ability to document and share truth in real time. The officer's backup arrived, pushing through the crowd outside. Their arrival only seemed to intensify the situation. More phones appeared, more cameras recorded, more voices joined the chorus of protest. The afternoon sun caught their badges, sending bright flashes through the store windows. "They can't just ignore all of us," Mr. Rodriguez declared, still filming. "We're all witnesses. We all know her." Around him, other customers nodded in agreement. The community had become a united front, standing together against what they saw as a clear injustice. The girl's tablet still sat on the shelf where she placed it, the inventory program still running, a silent witness to the unfolding scene. One of the customers pointed it out to the arriving officers. "Look, she was working. That's the store's inventory system right there." Social media was ablaze with updates. Local community groups shared the story, adding context about the store's history in the neighborhood, about the family that owned it, about the teenage girl who'd grown up behind that counter. Each post added another layer to the truth. Outside, someone had started a livestream interview with regular customers who'd stepped out of the store. They spoke about buying their morning coffee there for years, about watching the owner's daughter grow up, about the store's role as a neighborhood landmark. Their words painted a picture that contradicted every assumption the officer had made. The backup officers exchanged uncertain glances as they took in the scene, the crowd of witnesses, the running cameras, the clear support from the community. This wasn't the simple shoplifting case they'd been called to assist with. This was something else entirely. Through it all, the girl maintained her composure, though tears occasionally slipped down her cheeks. She could hear the support of her community, could feel their presence rallying around her. Every person who spoke up, every phone that recorded, every voice that joined the protest gave her strength. "Your father's 5 minutes away," Mrs. Chen called out to her, still clutching her phone. The news seemed to electrify the atmosphere. Everyone knew that the next few minutes would bring this situation to a head, one way or another. The story had taken on a life of its own now, spreading beyond their neighborhood, becoming a symbol of something larger. What had started as a routine afternoon in a local store had transformed into a moment that would force their city to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice and power. The store's bell chimed one final time, and the crowd outside parted like waves. A tall man in a business suit rushed through the door, his conference badge still hanging around his neck, his face a mix of concern and controlled anger. The store owner had arrived. The atmosphere in the store shifted instantly. Regular customers stepped back, making way for him, their phones still recording every moment. The backup officers straightened their postures, sensing the change in the air. The original officer, however, remained focused on his young suspect, seemingly unaware of the approaching storm. What is going on here? The father's voice was calm, but carried the weight of 15 years of business ownership, of community respect, of parental protection. His eyes took in the scene, his daughter in handcuffs, his customers filming, his assistant manager still on the phone with what appeared to be the police station. Mrs. Chen stepped forward first. "They won't listen," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We all tried to tell them. The officer wouldn't check anything." She gestured to the tablet still sitting on the shelf, the inventory program still running on its screen. The father moved closer, his steps measured and deliberate. The officer finally turned, one hand still gripping his daughter's arm. "Sir, please step back. This is a police matter." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with irony. A police matter. The father's voice remained steady, though his hands had formed into fists at his sides. "Officer, I'm the owner of this store. That's my daughter you have in handcuffs. She's working, doing inventory for me while I was at a supplier's conference." The backup officers exchanged glances, one of them reaching for his radio. The original officer's face showed the first flicker of uncertainty. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification," he said, his authoritative tone wavering slightly. Without breaking eye contact, the father reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his wallet. "Here's my driver's license," he said, "and here's my business license. The same one that's framed on the wall behind the counter. The same one that has been there for 15 years. The store remained absolutely silent as the officer examined the documents. Even the usual hum of the refrigerators seemed muted. Outside, the crowd pressed closer to the windows, sensing the turning point in the drama they'd been witnessing. "I've been in meetings all day," the father continued, his voice gaining strength. "I have dozens of witnesses who can confirm I was at the supplier's conference. My daughter was here, doing her job, helping to run our family business. And now I find her in handcuffs." The assistant manager had finally hung up the phone and moved closer. "Sir," he addressed the backup officers, "we have security footage of everything. It shows her doing inventory. It shows the officer refusing to check her ID or listen to any of us." The original officer's face had begun to redden, the reality of his mistake becoming clearer with each passing second. The handcuffs that had seemed so necessary minutes ago now felt like evidence of his own prejudice. "I want those handcuffs off my daughter. Now." The father's words weren't loud, but they filled the store completely. They weren't just the words of an angry parent or a business owner. They were the words of a man who had built something valuable in this community and wasn't about to let anyone threaten that. The security cameras continued their silent recording as the scene approached its climax. Soon, this footage would become part of a larger conversation, a teaching moment, a catalyst for change. But right now, in this moment, it was simply capturing a father standing up for his daughter, supported by a community that knew the truth. The sound of handcuffs unlocking echoed through the store. The officer's hands shook slightly as he removed them, his earlier confidence replaced by the dawning realization of his mistake. The young girl rubbed her wrists, her father's protective hand now resting on her shoulder. The transformation in the officer's behavior was striking. Gone was the aggressive stance, the commanding voice, the certainty of his actions. Now he stood awkwardly, his body language showing discomfort as he faced not just the store owner, but an entire community armed with video evidence of his prejudiced assumptions. "Sir, there seems to have been a misunderstanding," the officer started, his voice notably softer than before. One of the backup officers winced at these words. They sounded hollow in the face of what had just happened. The community members who had witnessed everything exchanged knowing looks. The father's response was measured but firm. "A misunderstanding? My daughter was doing her job. Every person in this store tried to tell you that. Your body camera recorded them telling you that. The security cameras recorded them telling you that. All these phones recorded them telling you that." The store's tablet still sat on the shelf, its screen showing the interrupted inventory count. The assistant manager picked it up, holding it like evidence. "She was literally counting stock when you came in," he said, his voice carrying years of suppressed frustration with similar incidents. Outside, the crowd had grown even larger. News vans had started to arrive, their satellite dishes reaching into the darkening sky. The story was no longer just about one store, one officer, one mistake. It had become something bigger. A moment that would force many to confront uncomfortable truths. "We're going to need all of you to provide statements," one of the backup officers announced, trying to take control of the situation. He pulled out a notepad, looking around at the sea of phones still recording everything. "And we'll need copies of all video footage, including the security cameras." Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her phone still streaming. "I've been shopping here for 15 years, she said, her voice clear and strong. "I watched this young lady grow up. She helped her father every weekend. But you didn't bother to ask any of us, did you?" Her words carried the weight of countless similar incidents, both witnessed and experienced. The original officer's face had turned a deep red. His body camera continued recording as he shifted from foot to foot, documenting his dramatic change in demeanor. The same technology that had recorded his aggressive behavior was now capturing his discomfort at being proved wrong. "I want your badge number," the father said calmly, "and your supervisor's contact information. This is Nova." His words weren't angry, but they carried the promise of action, of consequences, of change. Around him, customers nodded in agreement, their phones capturing every word. The contrast between the officer's earlier behavior and his current demeanor was stark. His attempts to maintain authority had crumbled in the face of truth, community solidarity, and undeniable evidence. The power dynamics had shifted completely, exposed by the harsh light of justice and community support. Through it all, the security cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of this transformation. The footage would soon become part of a larger conversation about bias in law enforcement, about the power of community, about the importance of standing up against injustice. What had started as a routine afternoon had become a catalyst for change. The next morning, the convenience store became the center of local news coverage. Camera crews set up outside as the morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk. Inside, the phone rang constantly. Calls from reporters, community leaders, and concerned citizens, all wanting to know more about what had happened. The girl sat behind the counter with her father, watching as the security camera footage played on every local news channel. Their small family store had become the focus of a much larger conversation. Social media was flooded with videos from different angles, each showing the same story of prejudice and community support. "Look at the comments," the assistant manager said, scrolling through his phone. "People are sharing their own stories. This is happening all over the city." The hashtag with their store's name had been trending since the previous night, carrying their story far beyond their neighborhood. Local news reporters interviewed regular customers who had witnessed everything. Mrs. Chen spoke passionately about watching the young girl grow up in the store. Mr. Rodriguez described how the family business had become a cornerstone of the community. Each interview added another layer to the story, painting a picture of a neighborhood united against injustice. The police department had issued a formal statement promising a thorough investigation. The officer involved had been placed on administrative leave, his previous arrest records now under scrutiny. His body camera footage, combined with the store's security videos and dozens of cell phone recordings, left no room for denial. "We've received calls from civil rights organizations," the father told a group of concerned neighbors who had gathered in the store. "They want to help make sure this leads to real change." His daughter sat beside him, still processing the previous day's events but determined to turn them into something positive. Community leaders began organizing meetings to discuss similar incidents in their area. The store became more than just a place to buy groceries. It transformed into a symbol of resistance against prejudice, a reminder that communities could stand together against injustice. The young girl's school principal called, offering counseling services and suggesting she share her experience with other students. "Your story could help prevent this from happening to someone else," the principal had said. The girl thought about all the other teenagers who might face similar situations. Local business owners stopped by throughout the day, showing solidarity and sharing their own experiences. Some brought food, others offered legal contacts, and many simply came to say they stood with the family. The small store had never been so busy, yet hardly anyone was there to shop. The officer's previous precinct is reviewing his old cases, the assistant manager reported, reading from his phone. They're looking for patterns in his arrests. The news brought mixed feelings. Satisfaction that action was being taken, but sadness that it had taken this incident to prompt the review. Outside, someone had started putting up posters about knowing your rights. Another person was handing out flyers about community organizing. The sidewalk that had witnessed yesterday's tension was now becoming a space for education and activism. The security cameras that had captured yesterday's incident now recorded a different scene, one of unity, support, and determination to create change. Every person who walked through the door brought not just their business, but their commitment to standing against prejudice. 3 months after the incident, the convenience store looked different. New posters about community rights decorated the walls, and a small bulletin board near the entrance displayed information about local advocacy groups. But the biggest changes weren't visible. They were in the hearts and minds of the people who gathered there. The young girl stood behind the counter, no longer just helping with inventory but leading a youth advocacy group that met in the store's newly renovated back room. Every weekend, teenagers from across the city came to share their experiences and learn about their rights. Many of them had similar stories, but now they had somewhere to turn. "Remember when this was just a storage room?" the assistant manager asked, watching another group of young people arrive for the weekly meeting. The father had transformed the space into a community center, turning a painful experience into something positive for the whole neighborhood. The police department had made changes too. New mandatory bias training programs were in place, developed with input from community leaders. The officer involved had gone through extensive retraining and, more importantly, had asked to meet with the family to apologize in person. It wasn't an easy meeting, but it was an important step toward healing. Outside, a local artist had painted a new mural on the store's side wall. It showed diverse hands joined together, forming a chain of unity around the building. Customers often took photos in front of it, sharing the message of community strength on social media. "Your father's speaking at the police academy next week," Mrs. Chen reminded the girl as she bought her groceries. The store owner had become an unexpected bridge between law enforcement and the community, sharing his family's story to help future officers understand the impact of their actions. The security cameras that had captured the original incident now recorded a different kind of daily life. They showed officers stopping by for coffee and friendly conversations with customers. They captured community meetings where people from all backgrounds came together to discuss making their neighborhood better. "Look at this," Mr. Rodriguez said one morning, showing everyone a newspaper article. The story about their store had sparked similar initiatives across the city. Other business owners had started their own community programs, creating a network of safe spaces where people could find support and understanding. The young girl's advocacy work had earned her a scholarship for college. "I want to become a civil rights lawyer," she told visitors who asked about her plans. Her experience had shown her the power of knowing your rights and standing up for others. The store's new community center had become her training ground. Local schools now brought students to the store as part of their social studies curriculum. The father and daughter shared their story, but they always emphasized the role of the community. "It wasn't just about us," they would say. It was about everyone who stood up that day. The final changes to the police department's policies were announced at a community meeting held in the store. New guidelines required officers to thoroughly investigate situations before making arrests, especially involving young people. The father's persistence had helped create lasting change. As the sun set on another busy day, the girl looked around at what their family store had become. What started as a painful incident had transformed into a movement for positive change. The security cameras still rolled, but now they captured stories of hope, unity, and the power of community standing together against injustice. The store's bell chimed as another customer entered, and the girl smiled, ready to greet them. This wasn't just a convenience store anymore. It was a symbol of what could happen when people refused to let prejudice win, when a community united to protect its own, and when even the darkest moments could lead to positive change.